the one and only Dr. Mike Licona, and we would like to welcome him now as our special guest. What's up, Dr. Mike Licona? How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing just great. Thanks for having me on.
Good. It's very good to talk to you. Here's what we are talking about. The sort of big question of today's show is a really important one. Who wrote the New Testament? Who wrote it? Who wrote the New Testament? Now, obviously, we're going to be talking about human authorship here, and we're going to sort of focus in on the Gospels. And before we even do that, Dr. Licona, help us understand, why is it even important for a Christian, or even for that matter a non-Christian, to ask this question, who wrote the New Testament? Why is that even relevant? Who cares, really? Why does that necessarily matter as you read the New Testament?
Well, I think, you look at the traditional authorship, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and John, according to early church tradition, were two of the 12 apostles. And Mark got his information from one of the main ones, Peter, and then Luke got his information from the eyewitnesses, although they're not named, but it would have been the original disciples, apostles who followed Jesus. So if the traditional authorship, the stories of the traditional authorship reported by the early church are mistaken, then we've got to ask, where did this information come from and how reliable is it?
So does it mainly have to do with the importance of... First of all, it helps us know who it is, and some of these people are mentioned in the New Testament itself, so we have an idea, for example, Luke, a physician, those kinds of things. And it also gives us an idea they could have been connected to eyewitnesses, but if it's not them, then it's like, well, who is it? Were they connected to eyewitnesses? Who were these people? Do we know anything about them? So is a big part of it have to do with the eyewitness aspect?
Sure. Yeah, we want to know how reliable the testimony is, and if it's not tied to the eyewitness testimony of, say, Matthew and John, and indirectly to Peter and the others through Mark and Luke, then, how reliable is the testimony? Do we have eyewitness testimony within these Gospels? Can we trust it?
All right. Now, I heard a little, it's like a miniature video clip where you're talking about this, and let's just start right here. You begin by saying there's sort of firmer or stronger attestation for Mark and Luke out of the four Gospels. Can you talk about that? What is that attestation, and why is that strong?
Well, I guess in terms of stronger attestation for Mark and Luke, no, what I mean by that is the evidence seems to suggest, or is accepted by more scholars, for the traditional authorship of Mark and Luke. Even when we take all scholarship who study the subject, New Testament scholarship, into consideration, and that would be conservative, liberals, agnostics, atheists who are New Testament scholars, and yes, there are agnostic and atheist New Testament scholars, plenty of them.
Yeah.
Bart Ehrman would be one, Gerrit Ludemann would be one, John Dominic Crossan would be one. So when you take all them into consideration, the majority of New Testament scholars who studied the subject would agree that Mark wrote Mark and Luke wrote Luke. They would agree to the traditional authorship with that. Matthew and John, there are people who disagree with that. In fact, even some evangelicals like Ben Witherington, Jan van der Waart, F.F. Bruce, they question whether John wrote John, and seem to suggest that, as is popular amongst some today, even some evangelicals, that a disciple of Jesus, but a minor one, wrote the Gospel of John.
So someone under 17? Sorry, bad joke. You said a minor disciple. No, I know it's not what you meant.
No, it was John the Elder, so he was older.
Right.
Well, can I ask a question about John then? Because not only it's the issue of eyewitness, but also just the veracity of the claim of the documents themselves. That's important here, right? So in the case of the Gospel of John, if, and those evangelicals at least that dispute that, how serious do you think that is with regard to which John was it?
I don't think it's that serious at all. Someone like Witherington would say that the person who wrote John was one of Jesus' disciples, and as we know from the Gospels, he had more than 12 that followed him around. It was just the 12 were, the leaders, the main leaders, but there were more than 12 disciples who followed Jesus, and so it would have been one of those minor disciples rather than the Apostle John.
So like John 21:24 says, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Now, technically, he doesn't say, and my name is John or something. So I think like Ben Witherington III, who you mentioned is out there at Asbury, would say, yeah, okay, so it's the disciple whom Jesus loved, but he doesn't actually say it's John. In fact, I know Witherington believes actually it's Lazarus, but Witherington would still say that it's the written word of God, that a testimony is true. He would just say, look, it doesn't say, and I think, for example, it's Lazarus. Is that a true summary of those positions, Licona?
Right. Yes, that is an accurate summary.
Well, but you just threw me a curveball, Vocab, because there's a difference between which John is it, and the text doesn't nail it down 100%.
But does it ever say John in John?
No.
See, that's the thing. I don't think it does.
Now, I mean, that doesn't mean that there's not good reasons for believing that John wrote it. You have Craig Blomberg, an evangelical. You have Craig Keener, who has written a more than 1,600-page commentary on the Gospel of John.
Those are big.
Oh, they're huge. And, these are two Johannine scholars, evangelical scholars, great scholars, and they both argue for the Johannine authorship of the Gospel of John, and there's several, arguments for this. So, the testimony of the early church fathers would just be one of those. But, another one you could say is, well, if John didn't write it, then, why is he not even mentioned in the Gospel of John? He would have been one of the three big ones, according to Paul in Galatians, one of the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John. Why isn't he mentioned in the Gospel of John if he's not the beloved disciple? So I'm not a Johannine scholar, one who has specialized in that, so I don't really want to come down on one side or the other on this. I can just say that there are good solid evangelical scholars who would say the author of John's Gospel was John the Apostle. Others would say no, but it was one of Jesus' minor disciples and who would likewise have been an eyewitness. I think we need to keep in mind, and this is hard for many Christians, we need to keep in mind that the early church fathers weren't flawless. They weren't inspired by God in their writings, and sometimes they report things that we can show to be wrong. So it doesn't mean that their reports are unimpeachable. So they might be right in terms of the traditional authorship. They may not be in some of these things. But either way, whether we take it as John or one of the minor disciples, we still have an eyewitness who is involved in writing the Gospel of John.
So really the contention of Ehrman and others, kind of, as you mentioned, agnostic or atheist New Testament biblical scholars, is sort of in this other direction of suggesting then that if the more doubt we have about the authorship of different biblical books, the more it suggests then that these books shouldn't be taken as authoritative? Oh, yeah.
In fact, he would go ahead and he would say that the Gospels are pseudepigrapha, that
he calls them forgeries
attributed to the four traditional authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But what Ehrman doesn't even consider in his book, that he leads readers to believe that the overwhelming majority of scholarship today would say that's the case with all four Gospels. That is simply untrue. As I've mentioned earlier in the program, the majority of scholars today would say that they would embrace the traditional authorship of Mark and Luke. You even have people like James D.G. Dunn, who in his second book on the historical Jesus, are called The Beginning from Jerusalem. He says that, I think that came out in 2009, 2010. He says that the traditional authorship of Matthew and John, the two that are most strongly doubted, he says the claim to the traditional authorship deserves respect. In other words, Dunn is saying, and he doesn't embrace the traditional authorship of Matthew or John, but he is saying that the evidence for the traditional authorship of Matthew and John is still such that it deserves respect. Even if you don't accept it, it's still there. It needs to be respected as a possible alternative.
Yeah, and to be clear, I do think the John we know did write John. I'm just saying that it doesn't necessarily say it. When we come back, let's look a little bit more about the authorship of these four Gospels, and let's give out the positive case for the sort of traditional attributions with Dr. Mike Licona. What are we actually talking about, and what are the questions we want to ask Dr. Licona at this point in the show?
Well, of course, we're talking about the question of who wrote the New Testament, and increasingly for for some scholars, particularly Bart Ehrman, they're questioning what's traditionally been understood to be the authors of the New Testament. Bart Ehrman would argue, and others would argue, that they're actually forgeries. That the people who claim to be, let's say, Peter or Mark or
James,
John, or James, any of those, who are claiming to be them, but are actually not. So just sort of, they're fakes. And obviously that puts into question the authority of Scripture and a number of other things. So what we wanted to do is begin to see how we might argue against that. And one of the things we talked about in the break that we want to bring out in this segment is, what do we do with some of the attestation, you might say, how does that help us begin to answer these questions? Some of the beginnings of these letters that say this is the gospel according to Matthew, or some of those other examples.
Yeah, well, the very first attribution we have to the traditional authorship is Papias. We don't know exactly when Papias wrote. He is usually, you'll have some dating him early as the year 95. You'll have others that date him as late as, say, 135. The typical or standard dating today for Papias is somewhere around the year 120. And he talks about the traditional authorship of the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. So he mentions those two. A few years later, around the year 145, you got a guy named Marcion, who ends up being what most consider to be a heretic, and he mentions the traditional authorship of Luke. And then a few years after that, around the year 150, you have a guy named Justin, who was martyred, and so he's called Justin Martyr, and he mentions the traditional authorship of Mark, and then he also quotes from Luke and calls it the Memoirs of the Apostles, part of the Memoirs. So he doesn't say it's attributed to Luke, but he does attribute it to it being the Memoirs of the Apostles, so that would go back to having eyewitness testimony. Irenaeus, around the year 170, 180, is the first to mention the traditional authorship of all four Gospels. And then from there, you have more. You have the anti-Marcionite prologue to Luke. You have Theophilus of Antioch, Tertullian, Clement of Alexander, the Muratorian Canon, other manuscripts, and like P75 and Origen. They all testify to the traditional authorship of the four Gospels, or any number of them, one or more of them. The point to be made here is that within the early church, the leaders who commented on this are a single voice in attributing the authorship of the Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There was never a dissenting voice. There wasn't someone who said Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Fred. It was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, without exception. So I think this unanimous testimony of the early church should weigh heavily in favor of the traditional authorship of the Gospels, and that anyone who wants to make another case, the burden of proof is going to be on them to show that it wasn't the traditional authors.
And something to remember is that these works were accepted, the Gospels especially, by a lot of Christians all over pretty fast, pretty far. For example, we have papyri of John in Egypt from about 125. And according to Dr. Wallace, we have first century fragments of Mark also from Egypt. So you see them going over. Now, the question is, would these Christians be accepting it sort of as just some guy they didn't know about? So it seems like the earliest people receiving the documents would know who they're getting this from, who the source is, who the eyewitness is, who the author is. And it's true that they're strictly anonymous sort of at the literary level, but I'm saying it seems like the authorship and origin would have been known in these immediate settings by these Christians. And I've heard people say, well, that's because those people in antiquity didn't care if the work was anonymous, but I don't know if that's true. For example, I have a little thing here about Tertullian, when he's writing against Marcion, and he seems to say that a gospel not bearing the name, I'm pulling some from a blog about this, of one of the gospels should not be received, meaning that he even chided Marcion because he had this mutilated version of Luke, and he left it anonymous. And part of what Tertullian, my understanding, said to Marcion is, hey, your one gospel that you mutilated, you don't even have a title on it anyway. So that's some of my understanding. I don't know if you want to comment on that. You don't have to necessarily agree or say everything I said is true, but that seems to be a good point, understanding these titles seem to be attached very early. They're unanimous in their attaching, and they seem to be done by people who know, so it's not lost as to who did it. Dr. Licona, quick comment?
Yeah, well, I'd say Martin Hengel, the late Martin Hengel, commented that he believed that these titles were attached to the four Gospels even as far back as early as the first century. So we're not certain that the titles were there, but we can talk in the next segment to show that it's really irrelevant.
And we will.
Dr. Licona, what I wanted to ask to start off this segment is something that I've read mentioned often is the fact that we have evidence that some of the biblical books, the New Testament books, were written by a secretary, you might say, by someone. Paul mentions this on a number of different occasions, and I think some people have argued that this suggests that if already we're admitting that an apostle himself didn't write it, that someone else was writing it, that this suggests that whoever was transcribing it probably it was understood that he would edit and he would maybe shape the content and other things like that. Is that a right description of that argument, and how would we begin to answer an argument like that?
Oh, I have no problem with that argument. I think, there's no question that secretaries were used in at least some of the writings of the New Testament.
Yeah. When
you look at some, like 4 of 7 of Paul's undisputed letters are unquestionably involving a secretary, such as Romans, 1 Corinthians, Philemon, Galatians, all of them. Yeah. Paul was very clear that he used the secretary, and in fact, in Romans 16:22, the secretary even chimes in and identifies himself. He says, I, Tertius, write this greeting with my own hand, or something like that. Who write this letter, greet you. So he definitely used secretaries. Now, the question is, to what extent did, say, Paul use them? And there's some other letters that he may have used them with, even some of his disputed letters. Even Bart Ehrman acknowledges that the use of a secretary by Paul could totally change things and really undermines the arguments that are used against the traditional authorship of many of the Pauline letters. So the question is, to what extent did Paul use them? And Ehrman turns around and he gives several reasons why he says Paul didn't use secretaries for anything else other than just transcribe, putting everything down that he was dictating to them. And I think that this is just very naive and wrong-headed on Ehrman's part. The reasons he gives are easily disproved. For one, he says he accurately says that Cicero and Atticus, from whom we have the two figures that we have most letters from that were transcribed by or had secretaries who edited and so forth. He says these guys were wealthy, they were powerful, influential. Paul was not wealthy or powerful, influential in any sense. But this is irrelevant. I don't see the relevance of this. Paul had people who volunteered. He lists them by names. They could have certainly acted as couriers. We know that he had secretaries. So in these undisputed letters, like I said, at least 4 of them, Romans, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Philemon, he had these things. These were very expensive. Something like Romans and 1 Corinthians would have cost over $2,000 in today's money to produce and to send off. But if Paul had people who were donating, churches that were donating and keeping him going, and if he had volunteers, traveling companions, that could have eliminated all those costs. So it's really not a problem. And one other argument he gives against the extensive use of a secretary is he says, the letters that were used by Cicero and Atticus, that where secretary was extensively employed, were very short. They were 300 to 1,000 words. Paul's letters are up around 7,000 words for like Romans and 1 Corinthians. That's correct. But, the thing is, he would grant that Paul used a secretary in 1 Corinthians and Romans. So he undermines his own arguments there. It's just weak. We have really good reason to think that Sosthenes was a co-author with Paul of 1 Corinthians. And in 2 Corinthians, Paul says he was a bad speaker, but his letters were powerful. So we got good reason to believe that they were involved.
Let's pick this up on the other side.
Dr. Licona, at the end of the last segment, you were engaging with Bart Ehrman. I had a question. Bart Ehrman admits that Paul used secretaries, and that if he did, it would substantially or could substantially change some of his critical commentary on the authorship. Help me understand a little bit better how you would respond to that. Meaning, the use of secretaries is there, and how does that undermine then some of Bart Ehrman's points?
All right. So I'd say when we're looking at, let's talk about the traditional authorship of Paul's letters and these disputed letters such as Colossians and Ephesians and the pastorals, 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus. A lot of times the reason that they say Paul didn't write these are stylistic reasons. They say the vocabulary, the grammar that's used in these are different than Paul's undisputed letters. Well, if we have a secretary involved, like, for example, as we were saying at the end of the last segment, Paul says in 2 Corinthians, hey, listen, I don't have training in public speaking. And many have said that, hey, Paul is weak in his presentation. He's a despicable public speaker. And he says, but, we're powerful in our letters. So what's interesting is he says, they're saying that Paul is despicable, but in his public speaking, but we are powerful in our letters. Well, who's we? Well, at the beginning of 1 Corinthians, Paul says Sosthenes and he are the ones writing this letter. So it appears that there was a co-author, according to Paul, when writing Corinthians. So suppose it was Sosthenes who was actually penning this, and they're agreeing about the things to put down. But Sosthenes is putting this in his own grammar, his own vocabulary, his own style and way of writing, and they're just discussing the topics to put, and Sosthenes is writing these things down, let's say. Well, then the grammar and style we have in 2nd or 1st Corinthians would actually be Sosthenean, not Pauline. And so to compare the pastorals with Corinthians and then saying, well, Paul couldn't have written the pastorals because it differs from the Corinthian correspondence would be, I think, naive and wrong, because it could be Paul writing the pastorals versus Sosthenes, whose actual style and grammar we have in the Corinthian correspondence.
And not only that, but what about the idea of time? So, 1 Corinthians, written at a certain time, perhaps 55 or so, maybe later, I'm not exactly sure of the time, but about 55. The pastoral epistles we're talking about probably towards the end of Paul's life, maybe 64 or something like that. Yep. And so there is a difference of, almost a decade. I mean, it seems we would take into consideration, someone doesn't write exactly identical is one thing. You add amensuouses, I think I guess that's how you...
that would be secretaries.
Yeah, secretaries, the plural, I think is how you say that word. You add that into the equation. Maybe even add into the equation the fact of sort of different settings. The writing from different places. Writing in prison or jail is sort of one thing versus chilling in somebody's house. You look at the length, the size coming into consideration. You look at the recipients, and you think about this. You sort of talk to different people different ways depending, and you even look at the subject matter. I mean, you add this up, and to run these literary analyses, the grammar doesn't match based on this grammar over here. It's really circular, and it seems really arbitrary and doesn't really prove anything. And I don't know why we would put so much stock in it. I don't think we should, is what I'm saying.
Well, I agree with you. And what I think would be an interesting study would be to take Ehrman's earlier writings, somehow do some sort of a computer analysis with the vocabulary, grammar, style, and then compare it with his later writings and see if you could make the same kind of a case.
Yeah, because his earlier stuff, you go back a certain amount of years, is more technical, academic. He wasn't write as many popular stuff. You take the stuff now and run it, and you can make a case that Bart Ehrman didn't write the Orthodox corruption of Scripture, for example.
That's exactly right.
But I think he did write it.
Well, another point that's often made, and I think you addressed it in one of the review you did of Ehrman's book, Forged, is that what we have is sort of what's reflected in our Bible the people who won, you might say, like, there are these kind of competing orthodox views, other books that could have been included but weren't, and obviously, it begins to help. It's like the Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code type of thing. Like there's this other kind of legitimate stream of theology that kind of got squashed down. And you make the point that, well, no, I think I'm just quoting right from a review here. You said, but sometimes the winners deserve to win. What do you mean by that in terms of just helping?
Do you think Jets fans would agree with that, Pastor Malone?
Well, they don't win, which means they're not winners.
They should win.
Sorry. Go ahead.
The NFL is keeping us down.
Well, when we say the winners deserve to win, there's good reasons for this, and the pedigree of these letters and literature that made it into the canon are far superior to what we have to these others. And Ehrman is the first to agree to this. In his New Testament introduction, he comes out and he says, look, these Gnostic and non-canonical Christian literature tell us, and they inform us what some Christians were thinking in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. He says, but if you really want to know about the real Jesus, there's only one place to go, the New Testament Gospels. And he says this is not for theological reasons, it's for historical reasons, pure and simple. That's from Ehrman himself. So one side of the mouth, he says, try to cast all this doubt and say, the early Christians were, they didn't mind forgeries and stuff. But then he ends up saying, hey, they did mind it. They all rejected it when it was known. And, none of those things that are known to be forgeries made it into the canon, by the way.
Yeah, Dr. Licona, you point that out in your review. It's a 20-page review. I encourage people to check it out at risenjesus.org. You point out the tendency of the early church was not to include, but actually rather to exclude. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how it relates to sort of books they accept and how that relates to authorship?
Well, sure. You have someone like Eusebius in the 4th century who comes out and, he classifies a lot of the literature. He'll say that, some of this was undisputed. This was definitely should be accepted. And he'll list things such as the 4 Gospels, Acts, all of Paul's letters, 1 John, 1 Peter, things like that. These are what Eusebius listed as undisputed. They should be in there. And then there were some things that the early church did question. It would be things like 2 Peter and Jude and James.
All of which are smaller, by the way. I think it's important to notice.
So, and I think it's fair to note that the church did question some of these. So they weren't just putting all these together and just saying, hey, if they agree with what we say, we will accept them. If they don't agree, then we reject them. No, they were very hesitant to include things within there. So it was only after years and centuries of talking about these things that the early church would very slowly allow some of these others in there.
In fact, Dr. Licona, Justin Martyr, when he's talking about what Christians would do with their services, he actually has sort of another way to describe the Gospels. He calls them memoirs of the apostles. I mean, that's actually what he describes them as. Their recollections, their memories of Jesus. I mean, there seems to be this sort of correlation of this is what these are. And, he's writing around 150 or so. So there's a pretty overwhelming early recognition of it. And my understanding is even the earliest critics of Christianity, Dr. Licona, weren't going around saying, oh, this guy didn't write your book, you don't even know who wrote it. They would do one of two things. For example, the Gnostics would say, well, yeah, maybe, but that was the wrong version. Here's the secret disciple that got the secret information that you forgot about. You need to hear this. Or they would just say, well, I'll just attack it for what it is. My understanding it was much later, during the time of Augustine, from what I've heard, where you finally have someone say, well, Matthew couldn't have been written by Matthew, for example, because he recollects his own calling. When he says that there's this guy, Matthew, sitting there, Jesus says, come follow me, all that. So it wasn't written by, my understanding is that's how long it took for a critic to say that, because it was such an established fact. And Augustine's response was, well, that's actually not true. Basically said authors do that all the time. And my understanding is we have plenty accounts of where you have ancient authors including themselves in the story, but not talking about themselves in the first, but rather the third person. There was a certain man named this, and he led this army and did this. Now, help me out on my facts. I'm just a radio host, but help our listeners. Is what I'm saying correct? Is it good argumentation? Help me be more precise, Dr. Licona, about what I just said.
I think it would be a good argument. I can't I can't comment on whether it's true or not. I don't know. I haven't heard that one, to be honest with you.
I picked some of that up from a lecture that I heard from Dr. Timothy McGrew called "Who Wrote the Gospels," and it seemed to be what he was saying seemed to be legit. But okay.
Tim McGrew is a great guy, and he knows his stuff. So if McGrew said it, I know he's got documentation for it, and so yeah, I would accept that and say it's a good argument. I do think in terms of, I do want to mention before the end of the program that in terms of the Gospels being anonymous, even if they were in the earliest manuscripts, and even people like D.A. Carson and Doug Moo in their Intro to the New Testament grant or acknowledge that the original manuscripts of the Gospels were probably anonymous. We don't know, of course, but even if they were, it wouldn't matter, because one of the most prolific biographers of antiquity, who was writing some around the same time some of the Gospels were written, his name's Plutarch. He wrote over 60 biographies. We still have 50 of them that have survived. And in nowhere in any of those biographies does Plutarch's name appear. Nowhere. So how is it then, since they're anonymous, why is it that almost every classical historian today acknowledges that Plutarch wrote those? Well, because there's no contrary testimony. And the Lamprias catalog from the 4th century, more than 200 years after Plutarch wrote, lists them as literature belonging and penned by Plutarch. So if classical scholars aren't going to question that, what you've got biblical scholars who are operating on testimonies by Papias and Justin and others, Irenaeus, writing far earlier, within, let's say, 20 to 100 years, and they're unanimous in their testimony about the traditional authorship, and yet you have New Testament critics who are just questioning it, ready to throw it all out, when we have more in favor of the traditional authorship of the four Gospels than we have for the traditional authorship of Plutarch's Lives.
Maybe a double standard there.
Well, something I think you've said in one of your reviews is, I mean, essentially this, that if we're to reject the what's been traditionally understood, the traditional authorship of these New Testament books, we need to have arguments that are much stronger than really what we've had so far, and I think that's really over and over. It does seem like as if the evidence that's put out there to try to make us doubt traditional authorship is really, I mean, it's threadbare. I mean, it's not strong. It's not really nearly as strong. I mean, there's nothing that suggests that we should throw out. So I mean, and I think the example you gave is really good. I mean, the received line that we've had so far.
Yeah, and I think we do have some decent evidence, good reasons to believe in the traditional authorship of all four of the Gospels and even most of the New Testament literature. But even if, let's just do the even if again for a moment, even if the testimony of the early church was mistaken in terms of at least some of the traditional authors, we still have reasons to believe that there is eyewitness testimony behind it. I think Richard Bauckham in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, gives us some. Yeah. I think we can also acknowledge that you have, as was mentioned a little earlier by one of you, that Justin Martyr, about 16 times in the literature that we still have from him, quotes from the Gospels that we have in our New Testament. And although on most occasions he doesn't attribute them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, he quotes from them and refers to them either as the memoirs or as the memoirs of the apostles. So we could say that even in Justin's day, by 150, when he's writing, it's pretty, the church at that point is recognizing what we have, what has come down to us as Gospels, as the memoirs of the apostles.
Yeah, and something else I think is interesting, if you look at who these Gospels, for example, were attributed to, it's not like they pick superstars. Mark, who's John Mark? He's mentioned very little, kind of a guy maybe running around. It's not like they said, well, let's just pick these big guys only. It seems as if they picked them because that's who actually wrote it. They weren't picking them. They were just saying the facts of the case. Matthew, the tax collector. And then they're willing to talk about a Gentile doctor who wasn't an eyewitness but actually interviewed eyewitnesses to say, yeah, attribute it to Luke. So we can see, I think, even by the types of people they're saying writing, it's sort of like the criterion of embarrassment in that it's just saying who wrote it, not trying to make something up. Dr. Licona, thank you for joining us.